Well, on behalf of USAID, I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar today on leveraging small local service providers for citywide water and sanitation services. My name is Jesse Shapiro. I am the Environmental Health Team Lead and Senior WASH Advisor based in the Bureau for Global Health at USAID. I help manage the Urban WASH project on behalf of USAID, who is the project that has organized this webinar and conducted the research that we'll see today. Urban WASH is one of the suite of mechanisms that's part of USAID's Action Research Initiative. The Action Research Initiative is USAID's flagship global investment in generating evidence and learning in the WASH and WRM sectors. It's really more than just research. The initiative really seeks to support relevant, timely, and trusted evidence and learning directly for policy and decision makers and with program implementers to ensure its uptake and use. The Action Research Initiative is supporting learning across a number of relevant topics, from area-wide sanitation to mobilizing finance to WRM, water resource and management, including the topic of focus today, which again is leveraging and formalizing small local WASH service providers. As I mentioned, this webinar is organized by Urban WASH. This is a 5-year activity led by Tetra Tech and is really specialized and focused on learning and for policy and programming in the urban and peri-urban areas of the WASH sector. We have a very exciting agenda for you tonight, today, and some amazing partners with us. So without further interruption, I'll hand it over to Abhishek Khanna from FSG, who is one of the contractors on the Urban WASH project. He'll introduce the agenda and research findings. Abhishek, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Jesse, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Abhishek Khanna from FSG, which is part of the Urban WASH Consortia, which is specifically looking at this topic of leveraging small local service providers for water and sanitation services. Before I get into the agenda and the findings, I want to provide some background and motivation for this research. Almost half the urban populations in low and middle income countries does not have access to piped water. The majority does not have sewage connections. City governments and utilities, the authorities mandated to provide services to urban populations, are often under-resourced and have not been able to serve growing urban populations. And it is in this context that over the last few decades, small local informal service providers have proliferated to address these service gaps. Small local service providers, or SLPs, as the term we'll use, play the critical role to provide water and sanitation services to informal settlements, peri-urban areas, and other marginalized urban populations. And to give you a picture, these SLPs can include tanker trucks, kiosk operators, or independent borehole operators that sell water. Or for sanitation, they can include emptiers that provide desludging services, often manually, but sometimes also through the use of mechanized equipment. Despite their prevalence, existing programs and studies largely ignore the impacts SOPs have on service delivery. We scanned a database of about 1,400 interventions from the database of 50 WASH funders and found only 30 interventions that were meaningfully engaging SOPs. This is what prompted Urban WASH to conduct an extensive desk review. This included a literature review of about 130 documents covering 50 countries, and in-depth case studies of 7 cities across Africa and Asia to understand approaches to integrate SOPs into citywide services. For today's webinar, we'll present some highlights from our research, which will then feed into a broader discussion on how cities in low and middle income countries can leverage these small service providers for water and sanitation services. We'll start with a 20-minute presentation where we'll cover 2 of our case studies as examples and then share the key lessons from our overall research. We will then spend an hour for a panel discussion and an audience Q&A. Today's panel, like Jesse mentioned, consists of a group of people who are intimately familiar with this process of leveraging small-scale providers. We have Oswaldo Moyambo, team leader at DNASH, the director of water in Mozambique, and George Joaquim, head of studies and projects department at ORA, the water and sanitation regulator in Mozambique. And both DNASH and ORA were at the forefront of the private sector engagement in Maputo, which is one of the case studies we'll discuss today. We also have Yvonne Mwando Sieni, the manager of peri-urban areas and fecal sludge management at the Lusaka Water and Sanitation Company, the public utility in Lusaka. And Lusaka will be the second case study we present. Finally, we have Asim Mansouri, the senior program lead at the Center for Water and Sanitation at CEP University, which has led similar interventions with the private sector for sanitation in the state of Maharashtra in India. Before we get into the presentation, I would encourage participants, like Joel mentioned, to share the questions on the online Q&A chat through the course of the webinar. We'll aim to collate the questions for the panelists and ask them during the last 30 minutes. And if there are specific questions on data or the research approach, we'll aim to answer them through the chat. Now let's start with the tale of the two cities, Maputo in Mozambique and Lusaka in Zambia, and how they approach the fundamental challenge of providing water and sanitation services to the growing urban populations in these cities. In 2010, only 50% of Maputo's million-plus urban population was served by the public utility. And most of these households were concentrated in the so-called cement city, or the central parts of Maputo. The rest was served by informal private water providers. Lusaka had similar challenges, but for providing sanitation services to its 2 million population, especially those in peri-urban areas. Through the course of the 2010s, both cities took a proactive decision to work with these small service providers as an alternative to expanding services themselves. Today, we'll talk more about their journeys, starting with Maputo. Private water providers, or PWPs, started emerging on the outskirts of Maputo in the 1980s. And to give a picture, these were essentially small-scale entrepreneurs who were extracting groundwater at home due to lack of institutional services. And they saw the business opportunity to sell to their neighbors who also lacked water services. And this started the process of them selling water within their community without a formal license. With urbanization, they proliferated to such a degree that in the late 2000s, they started running into territory conflicts with the public utilities. This prompted a broader discussion in the Mozambique government sector. There was one side which saw the need to regulate them, and equally, there were voices which wanted to ban them completely. And this sets the background for the 2010s, where the tide generally moved towards formalizing them rather than banning them. One of the reasons the tide moved in this direction was the formation of AFORAMO, the Association of PWPs, in 2008. AFORAMO and its members strongly believe that PWPs were providing an essential service to urban populations who would otherwise not have access to water. So they came together to deliberate and negotiate given the concerns that PWPs might get banned. The formation of AFORAMO then provided a platform for an intense consensus-building process that took the better part of a decade, but led to the creation of a licensing framework for PWPs in 2015. A key factor that allowed this to happen was the number and diversity of stakeholders that were involved in making this happen. We, of course, have DNASH, the director of water, that led the framework development, along with ORA, the regulator. But interestingly, AFORAMO was also involved and was consulted throughout this process by both DNASH and ORA. And in parallel, we had several USAID programs that were providing technical support to draft and implement the framework. For example, the SUWASA program was responsible for the initial mapping of these PWPs and provided support for drafting the framework. And subsequently, the Speed Plus program provided the tools and trainings to licensing authorities and the PWPs to navigate the licensing process. And finally, WashFin has continued this work. ORA, the regulator, then took the next step in evolving this framework and introduced tariff regulations in 2017. A key feature of these tariffs was that they were differential in nature based on the source of electricity for PWPs. The PWPs who were not connected to the public grid were allowed a higher tariff because the belief was that because they had higher costs due to the source of electricity. Now, despite the differential nature of these tariffs, it led to another round of conflicts, this time with Aura, because PWPs fundamentally cited these tariffs as unviable. Aframo again came in and acted as the mediator here. And after a few years of negotiation, the tariffs were revised in 2021. This is a recent development and brings us to Greater Maputo today, which looks very different from the early 2010s. Of course, PWPs have continued to proliferate, but now we have 500 plus licensed providers providing water to close to 1 million households. And equally importantly, an ecosystem that recognizes their role and provides a pathway to formalization. But challenges persist, and Dinash and Aura are keen to continue the journey. They're still exploring models for collaboration because despite the licensing, territory conflicts between the SOPs and the public utilities still persist. And Aura, too, as a regulator, wants to go beyond licensing and start actively regulating and monitoring the services of these PWPs. Eventually, they want to use the learnings from Maputo to regulate the private water systems that are emerging in the north. Now let's look at sanitation services in Lusaka, a different city and a different sector, but with a similar challenge. How can a city with limited resources extend essential services to growing urban populations? In the early 2010s, most of the population had non-sewage sanitation. The central, more affluent regions of Lusaka had septic tanks, which were emptied by vacuum truck operators. These were usually owned by business people and operated by drivers. But a key challenge here was that the disposal practices of these operators was highly inconsistent, with waste often just dumped in the open. The peri-urban regions, with 70% of the population, predominantly had pit latrines. They relied heavily on informal manual emptiers, and in general, these areas were characterized by limited space, high sharing, infrequent emptying, and unsafe disposal. The Lusaka of the early 2010s also suffered from outbreaks of cholera, and this situation led to a general urgency to tackle the sanitation problem in the city and was one of the key reasons for the private sector engagement that took place over the next decade. ZEMA, the Environmental Management Agency, started issuing licenses to vacuum truck operators in 2010 to control indiscriminate disposal of waste. And this became a critical milestone in many ways. While the initiative itself was limited in scope because it only looked at the central regions and largely ignored peri-urban, it set a precedent in Lusaka for the engagement of the private sector for fecal sludge management. NAWASCO, the regulator, took the next steps by expanding the mandate of utilities in 2014 to explicitly address on-site sanitation in peri-urban areas. In response, the Lusaka Water and Sanitation Company, or Lusaka Water, as it's termed locally, engaged in a series of partnerships to improve and expand emptying services in two peri-urban areas. It partnered with the Water Trusts, who were community-based organizations who were already working with Lusaka Water in these areas. And in turn, the Water Trust engaged about 20 local informal emptiers from these communities through MOUs. The intervention also had support from various partners. We had the Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, which helped identify and train these emptiers. And we also have the Stone Family Foundation and Comic Relief, which provided financial support to set up a treatment facility. In parallel, conversations to involve the private sector for sanitation continued at the national level. And in 2018, finally, NAWASCO released a framework that allowed utilities to subcontract services to private emptiers for sanitation. This framework enabled Lusaka to really scale up their intervention to all peri-urban areas, which they did through performance-based contracts with these emptiers. A key feature of these contracts was that Lusaka Water would release payments to emptiers only after they met some key performance indicators, which were verified by a third-party agency. And this was really to incentivize safer emptying and disposal practices. The prices to households were also subsidized with funding from the World Bank and others, which improved the general affordability of services in these areas. These interventions have continued in Lusaka today. Today, peri-urban areas of Lusaka have about 50 formalized emptiers, and about 200,000 people have benefited from safer emptying services. And similar to the case of Maputo, the market has a stark contrast from what it looked like in the early 2010s. Lusaka Water is now focused on scale and sustainability. It's exploring scheduled emptying to expand service delivery, and it's also thinking about sanitation surcharges as an alternative to donor support to finance these services. And at the national level, Navasco is encouraging other cities to engage the private sector based on the learnings from Lusaka, which is really considered a pioneer for this approach in Zambia. As we wrap up these two case studies, we want to emphasize again that cities across low and middle income countries need to consider approaches for engaging SOPs because the challenges of achieving citywide coverage are not unique to just these two cities. Importantly, from a customer perspective, our research highlights that SOPs in many contexts may be preferred by customers because they're better able to serve the needs of households. For example, SOPs will deliver services on demand. They may offer flexible payment options, and they do not ask for formal documentation, unlike utilities, before providing services. And these are things that households in informal and peri-urban settlements value. And this preference for SOPs is despite the fact that these services can often be more expensive, as we can see from the price chart on the right, and typically less safe. The stories of Lusaka, Maputo, and the other cities in our research present some key lessons which we believe can serve as a starting point for cities to think about leveraging SOPs. We'll go through 5 such lessons today. The first lesson is about what engaging SOPs looks like at the market level. Our research shows that there are essentially 4 types of market models in a city, depending on the interaction between the city and the SOPs. On the extreme left of the slide that we can see are what we call unregulated markets. These are markets where SOPs operate informally without any oversight from the city. On the right is what we would call served markets, where cities directly provide services to households. And these are the markets that many of us here experience. In the middle are the market models where the cities and the SOPs start interacting with each other. And broadly, there are 2 options. We have a facilitated market where cities can start recognizing SOPs and enabling their participation in the market. Or we can have a managed market where the cities start controlling the SOP's core offering, such as their pricing and marketing. And we call this process a market transition because when cities engage with SOPs, they're essentially transitioning unregulated markets to either facilitated or managed. So to give an example, the licensing framework for PWPs in Maputo, all the licenses provided to tanker operators in central Lusaka reflect a transition to facilitated markets, as these licenses enabled SOPs to start providing services with a formal right to operate. In contrast, the performance-based contracts that we just discussed from Lusaka reflect a transition to a managed market because the city was not only controlling how much SOPs were being paid, but also how they were being paid. The other case studies from our research also fit within this broad framework. The next few lessons talk about how cities can implement market transitions on the ground. First, cities need to understand and use political, social, and economic factors to build momentum for market transitions. Across case studies, we see that multiple such factors came together to serve as a trigger for cities to start leveraging SOPs. Political factors could include the territory encroachment conflicts we just discussed in Maputo, or unclear land rights in low-income areas in Manila, which limited the utilities' ability to extend services themselves. Social factors could include the cholera outbreaks that we discussed in Lusaka. And economic incentives could include, for example, the need to manage high non-revenue water rates, which were driven by theft in low-income areas in Manila, or the general limited resources of utilities to invest in trucks, as we saw in Kampala. The other enabling factor here is the need for cities to bring together and engage multiple actors, both at the national and the local level. Here, Lusaka is a really good example where there was a close interplay between national level policymaking and activities of the utility at the city level, which created a favorable ecosystem for engaging the private sector through the 2010s. And Maputo, Kampala, and Manila also reflect this general pattern of national and city actors across government and non-government sectors coming together and playing very specific roles to make change happen. Lesson 3 talks about the timeline of change. And our view is that cities need to have a long-term horizon, at least a decade, if not more, for implementing transitions because of the nature of how these transitions play out. Transitions happen at the micro market level, that is, specific regions in the city. And a city can consist of different markets at any given point. If you look at the right on the slide, we see the maps of Kisumu and Lusaka, and we also see that different parts of the city had different market models at any given point. And as we see the evolution of these maps over time, we also see that transitions are implemented incrementally in these micro markets. And this is what leads to this process of market transitions taking a decade or more. One of the reasons these transitions take time is the complicated nature of implementation, which brings us to the next lesson. Operationally, transitions require several coordinated actions by the city. Our research shows that there are broadly 3 types of actions that cities need to invest in. The first is managing the engagement with the SOPs, which we term as the player lever. The second is defining the terms of this engagement. For example, the guidelines or the tariffs, which we term as the rules lever. And finally, complementary business environment investments, such as setting up treatment facilities, which we term as the infrastructure lever. And to add to this complexity, the purpose of these actions changes by the market transition. So if you think about transitioning to a facilitated market, the purpose of the player lever is really on discovery of SOPs, because in an unregulated market, SOPs are often hidden and dispersed. But if you think about transitioning to a managed market, the purpose changes to really designing partnerships with a few number of SOPs so that the cities can control their prices and marketing much more closely. These actions and levers can be represented visually on the market transitions framework, which is represented on this slide. Now, as the last few lessons show, implementing market transitions is challenging because it requires several enabling factors to come together. It takes time, and it is operationally complex. But the final lesson from our research highlights that market transitions can have an impact and improve service delivery outcomes. Across the cities we studied, a meaningful number of households received formal services through market transitions. And at least in some cases, transitions also appear to have improved affordability and quality of services. Importantly, the household that was served through transitions would have otherwise remained unserved by the city. So we conclude that the approach of market transitions is promising because it can lead to more inclusive citywide services. But here we also want to note that the practice is nascent because there are still several evidence gaps. For example, the sector still needs to understand why some cities are able to engage the private sector and others are not. Our desk research only included positive deviance, that is, cities that were implementing transitions and engaging SOPs, since failures were not that well documented. Similarly, more data is required on the viability of services for different SOP models and the impact of transitions on services from the perspective of households or emptiers. The cities we looked at in the case studies did not document such financial impact data from the perspective of households and emptiers. Urban Wash, as part of USAID's Action Research Initiative, will be working on generating evidence on these topics through implementation research in approximately 15 cities across Zambia, Kenya, and Mozambique. This brings us to the close of the presentation. I will now pass the floor to Rishi, who will facilitate our panel discussion.
Great. Thank you, Abhishek. Thanks for the presentation, and thank you, audience, for putting the question in the Q&A box. Some of them have already been answered. The others we will try and answer over the course of the rest of the discussion. I would also like to invite my fellow panelists, Osvaldo, George, Yvonne, and Asim, to sort of join me by switching on the camera where possible. Welcome. And as Abhishek and Jesse had earlier said, please use the Q&A box to ask questions you might have for the panelists as well. I'd like to kick it off by asking a few questions of my own as a part of the learning agenda. So maybe I can start asking with you, as you've been working in South Asia, especially in India, on this topic quite a bit. So in your view on engaging the private sector with city municipalities in this very different context, can you share the differences and challenges of engaging the private sector in India? And as Abhishek was talking about more Maputo and Lusaka, how does that differ in your experience when you consider it to India?
Sure. Thanks, Rishi, for the question. I think one of the, maybe just to start with, that a major difference between sub-Saharan Africa and at least the cities in Asia, mainly India and Bangladesh and Nepal as well, that we have more local government models. Like you have utilities there, we have more the local governments who engage with the private operator for providing the service. So that is one major difference in terms of structuring of how the services are provided. And the main that in Africa, we have more like pits and pits are more, pit septic, the latrine pits are more. But in India, we have more of septic tanks because now under the Swachh Bharat mission, the pit toilets have been actually removed. Now, if you talk about some challenges, I would say that challenges of engaging with private operator and specifically in India from a local government's perspective are of two sides. So one challenge that a local government has always faced, and that has come out of our research work that we are doing in Maharashtra, is that they are always, the local governments are paying for non-performance of private operator. So how can that challenge be mitigated is one of the questions they always frequently ask us. And second, from the private operator side, and that's maybe true for even in Africa as well, the delay of payments to the private operator from a utility or from a local government. So how do you mitigate that as a problem? So to answer these queries around the main risk of non-performance and the delayed payments, in one of the cities, and which has been documented in the USAID document as well, and the cities of Sinnar and Vai, where we have actually implemented a performance-linked annuity model. So it's a very interesting model where the private operator enters into a contract with the local government to provide the service on behalf of the local government, and the households that are there in the city, they actually pay a sanitation tax, which is part of their property tax. Now, the important thing to highlight here is that in this structuring, the tax value is very less. It's almost like $3 a year as compared to $15 that the households used to pay before for the desludging services. Now, this sanitation tax value is actually parked into an escrow account, which is a tripartite agreement between the local government, the private operator, and the local bank. And based on the performance of the private operator, and I think my friend Abhishek actually mentioned that the septic tanks are being emptied, but they are not taken to a treatment facility. So in this model, what we have actually done is that the performance of the private operator is tied to providing safe emptying services to household and take that waste to the treatment facility. And until and unless this cycle is not completed, the local government does not pay to the private operator from the escrow account. So that way we are able to create a closed loop of collection as well as discharge of the fecal waste at the treatment site. And to monitor all this, we have actually now developed a very innovative tool called SaniTrack, which actually monitors the desludging. It's like a simple signature-based app like we have in Amazon, where you sign against the service and it's geo-coded, so you can't fudge around with that data as well. So such type of systems have now started to implement in India and specifically in Maharashtra where we are working. And these challenges which I mentioned about non-performance and delays of payments have now started, the cities in India have now started to work towards them through some of these innovative models that have been implemented in India. So I hope that answers the question, Rishi. Yeah.
Thanks, Asim. So broadly summarizing, there are contextual differences in who the implementation unit is. There are technology differences in the type of substructure that exists in two countries. And the challenges sort of remain same, which is how do you avoid paying for non-performance and how do you ensure timely payments to the private sector? And then you obviously have a bunch of interesting stuff that SEPT is doing to address some of these challenges. Thanks for that. That's quite useful to hear. Osvaldo, maybe I can sort of go to you next. Abhishek presented the case study of Greater Maputo, which is a particularly strong example of need and importance of multi-stakeholder participation and negotiation. Can you share the challenges of bringing such different stakeholders together and how you overcame, if there were any challenges in bringing these people together or getting them to work together? All yours, Osvaldo.
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to start saying that the private sector in Mozambique plays a key role in the process of supplying water to the population, and the government of Mozambique recognized this. So 2 years ago, the government of Mozambique and the Association of Private Water Supplies of Mozambique, AFORAMO, signed an agreement for the integration of the private sector in the public water supply system, which put an end to the overlapping problem that had been generating conflicts between public water supplies or public water companies and the private providers. So in the form of public-private partnership, the agreed model gives us a guarantee private providers to continue operating in the areas where the public network is expanding. So the main challenge that we can highlight certainly include the communication failures of the public network expansion measures currently underway in the country. So to overcome this challenge, it was first necessary to recognize that private suppliers as strategic partners in the water sector in Mozambique, and together work on the creation, on the implementation of more inclusive communication plan and a very high level of sharing the vision and objectives in relation to the expansion of the public network in the country. And this communication plan involved the definition of coordination mechanisms, such as meetings between the government and the private water supplies providers. So knowing how many private suppliers there are and where they are located also greatly supported the strategic definition of the expansion plan of public systems, avoiding overlapping investment in the same area. So we believe that this approach has resulted in a greater trust between the parties and vision of a common goal, which is to provide quality water supply service to the populations. So we are aware that the road is still long and full of challenge, but we believe that this is a strategic step towards this common vision. As an example, very recently, through the World Bank, the government mobilized about $8 to $10 million within the scope of the urban water security project dedicated to private suppliers, with in the form of grants or not, especially for the training component in different aspects of professionalization, for example, of the private operators, including technical aspect of operation, maintenance, and the management of water supply systems. So yeah, that is the briefly of our challenge that we face and how we overcame of this challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Osvaldo. Really, really great to hear that. So broadly, again, trying to summarize what you were saying. So ensuring long-term viability of the private players in areas where public sector might still expand coverage, making sure communication failures were being avoided by being inclusive in that, and ensuring treating them as partners rather than vendors. I think that sort of is probably a more a mindset thing, which is great to see happen. So thanks for that. Really appreciate that answer. Maybe, George, I could continue this conversation around Maputo with you in terms of as a regulator. Osvaldo talked more about in terms of how do you ensure conflict between various players, but as a regulator, your key responsibility is to ensure quality and affordability to the households, right? So what were the challenges that you face monitoring a large number of private sector operators, close to 1,000, and how are you thinking about addressing some of those? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the challenge is huge because, as you said, there's quite a large number of operators that are spread throughout the country, and to get information, data and information about their operations, the costs, is very difficult. So we don't have yet the platform to get this information. So to assess the quality of service, of course, because we have no information or no data, we have information to assess the services, their performance, even to set the tariff. Because as we saw in the presentation, we tried to have a kind of tariff, but we know that tariff are not does not respond specifically to the needs of these private operators, because they took their own money, their investment, to put in the system. So they need to recover. We need to protect the investment, but we don't have information, data to set up the right tariff for these operators, and even to assess the quality of their performance, to also promote the improvement of the service and protect also. We are talking about the cost of the investment, but need to protect also the customer interest. So we are kind of trying to find a mechanism, model on how to get information, and from there start contributing, promoting the quality of services and the tariffs, also set up the tariffs. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Thanks for the answer. So very clearly is around, obviously, monitoring costs for such a large number of providers, as you mentioned, is very, very expensive for any municipality or utility to take on its own. And also there's this balancing act, which I see there's a question around that as well in terms of profits for private players, but ensuring affordability for households. So those are the things you're tackling as part of your agenda, which is great to hear. Maybe Ron, I can jump from water to FSM a little bit with you in Lusaka. So again, the viability and affordability that George was talking about happens to be the same issue in FSM as well. Can you share your thoughts on achieving affordability while ensuring that private sector is adequately compensated, and as Asim was saying earlier, we still have safe management of the sludge? Over to you.
All right, thank you very much. For Lusaka water supply and sanitation, for us, it's been an interesting journey. Just maybe to build on the presentation that was made by Abhishek. So for Lusaka water, there are certain steps that we took, which made us to identify these challenges and also find solutions to these problems. First of all, we had a market that was not regulated. So the private sector had dominated the market of providing the FSM services in the city. And also that came with its own challenges, because the way the service was being provided, it was in an uncoordinated manner. Then also we saw that most of the users were not well catered for, and also sometimes they were not managed properly, and also there was some kind of all sorts of charges being lumped on the households, which also affected the service. So for us as a utility, for us to understand how we could achieve these challenges, first of all, we had to look at the market. We had to identify what are the inherent market barriers and failures. Through that, once those were identified, we had to restructure and formalize the market. So this helped us in a way to put a system in place that could help us, and also the service providers for them to provide the service. Then also through this, we had to catalyze the market, where we looked at provision of incentives, building capacity, so that the service providers were able to do that. So coming to the model that we are using, we are trying as much as possible to look at the affordability of the users, because this is a service that comes at a cost. For a household to afford for their toilets to be emptied, there are certain things that we've considered. When we look at the full cost of emptying, for most of the houses, it's not affordable. So through support that we've received from the World Bank and other donors, it was noticed that we needed to come up with some kind of help for the household. So in terms of affordability, how we've achieved this, we know the full cost of emptying, but we've been supported, and we have incentives that we are providing to the households for them to pay for this service. Of course, the question is, why are we looking at giving subsidies for the households when the toilets belong to them? We are looking at a market that has not yet matured. Then also because our households had an option of engaging an informal emptier to provide the service. So, and also for the private sector, we needed to steer the market for them. So by us providing this as subsidy, we've been able to see a lot of households coming on board. And also for us to achieve this, we've done a lot of community engagement, a lot of awareness, a lot of marketing, a lot of sanitation marketing, so that households see that indeed there is a way that this service can be provided by the utility through partnering with the service providers. Then also from the private sector, we've realized that for them, it's not an easy business for them just to move in and empty. The cost of doing business has to be considered. So maybe just to take us through how we came up with this, we came up with the performance-based contracting, where the service providers were identified who were already in this market. We saw how they were doing things, and we identified the gaps. So some of the gaps that we identified were they had challenges in terms of transportation. There was a challenge in terms of the facility where the emptying could be done. So we moved in to provide equipment for the households. We've given the light trucks to the manual emptiers on a lease-to-own basis, which is helping them to conduct the transporting of the sludge, which has made the business side of things very easy. Then also we've had to pay them some kind of a subsidy based on the target. So we have targets that we've given to all the service providers. This is a way of us ensuring that all of them are putting in their best. So that way it helps us to compensate the private sector for them to really see that indeed this is a market that they can dive into. So this has helped us in a way. We've seen an increase. When we started in 2020 with the performance constructing, we only had 6 service providers, but as we are talking, we have 13 companies who are on board. And we are also planning next year, we intend to increase the number because we want to open up the market where we can have more service providers on board so that we have them operating in these areas. Then also the other thing we've done is for us to zone the city into 3. Then we have areas where we have a number of operators operating there, and that way we are able to monitor. And also the other thing to note is, even as we are working with the private sector, it's very important for the utility to come up with a system of managing these service providers, because if not well checked, the operations can be affected, because there are a lot of things that we look out for. So one of the things that we have done as a utility is for us to set up a unit within the utility that monitors all these activities. Then also we do monthly inspections, monthly verifications, and also ensuring that we are monitoring all the way up to the end of the activity, so that at the end of the month, each service provider, we are able to monitor the targets in terms of the volume submitted. We are able to monitor the number of toilets emptied. We are able to monitor the household saved. Then also the other thing we do is for us to have feedback with the customers on a monthly basis, so that they give us feedback on the way the service is provided, if at all they are satisfied, whatever they note. Then the other thing also that we are doing is for us to ensure that our service providers abide to the service, the standard operating procedures, because we've realized that you need to really ensure that there is safety in the way emptying is being done. So this is how we've tried to achieve. So on the part of the household, on the affordability, we are helping them by also cushioning the cost of emptying, whilst for the service provider, we are also supporting them in terms of capacity, transport, and also we have an FSTP where they can empty, and we have 2 so far, and we are hoping to have more, so that by having more in every corner, in most parts of the city, we'll be able to help them by reducing the cost of doing business, because they don't have to cover a long distance for them to access the FSTP. So the model that we are using is helping us to achieve both in terms of cushioning the households on the affordability side, and also cushioning the LSP in terms of motivating them for them to stay in this business and continue to provide services to the residents within the city. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Clearly, I mean, the approach is holistic, addressing barriers and failures across the ecosystem rather than just at the consumer-provider intersection. So that seems like a fairly comprehensive approach. So thanks for sharing that data. Maybe turn the tables around a bit and see what you think are the most important evidence gaps that researchers like us should be tackling on the topic of engaging small local providers. I think you have been engaging and working and trying to struggle through to get to a viable model for a long enough time. What is it that you think are the key questions that the sector should be exploring further? Maybe Asim, I can start with you, and then Osvaldo, Jose, and George, and Yvonne.
Sure, Rishi. Yeah, I think thanks for the question. I think what I feel, and that to maybe more India specific it could be, but the whole debate between a bundled contract versus an unbundled contract. So for example, in FSM, should I go for an integrated contract where I give the desludging services as well as the FSTP operations to one private operator, or to increase the market size, or should I segregate them? Because I still feel that there are some pros and cons. For example, if it's the same operator, I could fudge with the numbers as well. But on the other side, it also leads to synchronizing the activities of desludging and treatment operations. Because if the plant is not functional, your operations can be paused, and there is no issues between the 2 private operators if it's the same one. So I still feel that there is some discussions from a market angle, from risk mitigations perspective, that we still need to answer. We have been trying to work on this as well, but it's a gray area, I would say. That is point number 1. And the other thing that I feel that in this sector, at least to encourage more private operators, can we look at the allied services, like for example, the SWM service, right? They are also similar. It's a solid waste transportation system that they provide. But can they be involved, or can there be policies that actually, or what do you say, conducive market that they can also enter this market, because they come with the experience of emptying as well, the solid waste collection as well. But can they be involved for desludging services? Can they be brought into the market? I think is another question that we can look at. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Asim. Osvaldo, do you want to go next?
Yes, sure. So in relation to this question, we can affirm that the factors that still condition the cohabitation between the public and the private systems constitute one of the most prominent research opportunities that should be considered. So we feel that there is a need to deepen and understand the process. For example, the criteria that must be considered for each reality when for a certain situation in which the public sector begins to operate when a private supplier, the private providers already has its own infrastructure and vice versa. So how can these elements support the elaboration of different normative instruments for the water sector in Mozambique? So what is the framework we can take to monitor, for example, the rapidly increasing number of small private water supply providers? How to ensure, for example, that the sustainability aspects are all considered and included? How to ensure that we still continue, for example, the provision of service by private water suppliers when there are some big problems in terms of, or that requires investment in terms of operational aspects. The role and responsibility of the government in the case of lack of provision of this service by private providers, for example. So for us, these factors needs to be seen really deep, and we need to learn and understand this factor, because we know that there are a really different situation in Mozambique, even in the great area of Maputo. We can learn from that, and we can study with details how that factors that still condition for the cohabitation between the public and the private system needs to be addressed. So this and other elements naturally correspond, in our opinion, to some of the research opportunities for Mozambique.
Thanks, Osvaldo. George, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. For me, the point is that to get commitment, because for engagement of local service providers, the issue is that we are new in this process. We are starting involving the local small service providers. So the public entity who has this duty to do the service, they feel that they are the owners of this field, and there's no space. They don't see the private as partners, as say the Muyambo, that the private are strategic partners. But in the public entity, they don't see them as partners. They say as a contester, because these guys are taking us services, source of revenue. So the first thing is to come up with the examples. I saw some example from Zambia, and evidence that it's better. The service will be carried out. The customer user will be certified if you involve also at the small local providers in this chain, this service, because with the public entities, they have no capacity to address, to respond to the demand. So if they liaise with the public, with small providers, then the service will be carried out, and they will do their duties. Let's say at high level, let's say public entities, they do the specific tasks. Then there's a space there for the small private local providers to do the job. So the idea is to get the commitment of the public entity that the market is space for the small providers. So I think we need to work on that. Once we get this commitment, this understanding of the public entity, then I think things will roll smoothly. So my issue here is engagement, understanding, and we should bring the examples, evidences, studies, statistics showing that it's better if we partner with the small local providers. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Yvonne, do you want to add to that list?
Thank you very much. I think for us, where we need more research is we've seen how we've been able to work with the private operators, because right now we are more like we are keeping them because there's something that we are offering to them. So we would want more research on maybe just to find out more, what can we do to keep these service providers in the absence of the subsidy. So what can motivate, or how can we keep these service providers to continue providing this service in the absence of a subsidy? Because at one point the subsidy will not be there. So is it something that they can continue moving with? Because we've seen the way it was before and now there's a very big difference. Because I think one thing that we need to notice right now, of course, we are doing all this because there are incentives. Then also we would want more research on the business model that we are using. We would want it maybe to review in the absence of the incentives. How can we maintain the private sector to continue with what we've already started, so that we don't lose what we've already done over time?
Great, thanks, Yvonne. So just to summarize from the panel, there is a contracting mechanism question, which is around whether it should be bundled or unbundled. How do you look at other participants, such as solid waste management companies, providers, to participate in the value chain, factors that might influence the public-private partnership, and how do you manage those? George had a point around how do you prove to players, especially utilities, that public-private partnership is actually better for customer, delivers better value, and is useful. And Yvonne, your point around sustainability of private sector partnership beyond subsidies, and what does that business model look like? So I think that's a fairly rich agenda. So thank you for that in terms of laying out some pieces of work which USAID might be able to pick. We also have a fair amount of questions coming in from the audience, so maybe I could start with some of those. Thank you all for putting those questions in the chat box. For one of the questions is that we learned during the presentation that political issues often affect long-term plans for wash service deliveries. And also, we saw in the presentation that change takes a long time. This is not a 3 to 4 year journey. It is a 5 to 10 year, or Osvaldo was saying, the road is long. It takes a long time to get there. So how do you circumvent this or manage this while planning? What are the key insights, either mechanisms, processes that you have used as you think of this? Maybe you could start with Osvaldo, then George, and then Asim and Yvonne. Osvaldo, do you want to take this first? Sorry, I'm just cold calling. Maybe any of the panel, if they want to take this first, I'm happy to sort of let anyone go.
Yeah, I can go ahead in case.
Sure, Hassan, go ahead.
Yeah, great. So mainly in India, and I think the work that we have done in the cities of Maharashtra, it almost dates like a decade now. So it's almost like a decade that we have worked with the cities to bring them to this level. And two important learning, I think it's a very valid question. I think whoever has asked this from the participants, and it has been a crucial issue as well, that how do you weave your way through the changing political agenda and all. So what we have done two things. One thing is that at the city level, at least in India for sure, we have the city council resolutions, which are like an executive order, which is approved by the head of the executive wing, who is the commissioner or the chief executive officer. And it's also approved by all the elected representatives as well as the mayor of the city. During that point of time, whoever is there in the administrative department. So this is an executive order that is signed by all of them. And generally, if that is signed, so for example, the work of scheduled desludging that we have done, we got the executive order signed in 2012. And because of that, that activity still sustains. 3 times political parties changed. 4 times the chief officers changed. The chief executive officers also changed. So that's the way you can actually institutionalize the activity within the government system. And I think very important point that we have learned is that it's not only to work at the top level of the chief executive officer or the mayor of the city. You have to work with the department people who are generally permanent. So if they are there and if they are able to talk with the next political party or the next officer, it's actually adopted quite easily, rather than an external consultant or a person, maybe let's say going and talking with them. So these two activities, if you do, we have actually sailed through this sea for last 10 years now, and we are fairly confident about these two approaches to make your thing sustainable and institutionalized within the system. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hassan. George, Osvaldo, Yvonne, anything to add to that in terms of how do you navigate the long-term political agenda as you are trying to build this public-private partnership?
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, Yvonne, you want to go first, then George?
Yes.
Yvonne?
Yes, so for us, we've looked at it from all angles. So private sector engagement is something that we've adopted even at national level. If you see, we have the OSS, a regulatory framework that emphasizes on partnership, because we've realized that we cannot do it alone as a CU. So we have different players within the sanitation service chain. So as a CU, we can't do everything. Therefore, for us, private sector engagement is the way to go. And from what we've done so far, we've seen that it has worked very well. So even at national level, that is being promoted. And it's something that we are still perfecting. So the only thing is we need to find a way of us maintaining such that even as we do this, we do not disadvantage the service providers, but we find a way of maintaining them so that as we go, they can even do better than what we are doing currently. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. George, you want to add?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, the issue here is that we are aware, the government and all the stakeholders are aware that the SDGs are at the door, and we are lagging behind. So I think the best thing to do is just to join all the efforts for all the stakeholders, to bring together all their contribution effort to improve the situation, because there's no resource. As Yvonne was saying, the government or public, they have no resource to respond. So let's open the door for all the stakeholders to give their contribution to improve the situation, and for the well-being of the people. So, I mean, when we see the SDGs and where we are now, then I think the doors open automatically. So this is the point. Thank you.
Thanks, George. That's points well taken. So just sort of have the bigger picture in mind, work at both the top and the ground level, and sort of figure out how do you join efforts for all stakeholders. So that's very useful. Thank you. The other question we have is around the examples that we shared, at least in the presentation, were all about capital cities, whether it's Lusaka or Maputo. How do you see this effort translate into some of the smaller cities within, let's say, Mozambique and Zambia, or in India, same way you have done work in some of the smaller cities you were mentioning, Sinnar and Wai. So what are the changes you've had to make, or what are the changes that you are seeing coming through as you're implementing some of these initiatives in the smaller cities in the country? Yvonne, Asim, do you want to go first? Either of you? Or Oswaldo? Yeah, Yvonne, go ahead.
Yeah. So for us, with what we've done so far, we've seen that we've also contributed in shaping the policy in how we provide the service. Because by us realizing that we cannot do everything as a utility, so the small scale providers have come in handy for them to take up that which we can do as a utility. And for smaller cities, with the experience that we've had in Lusaka, we are hoping whatever we do moving forward will even be better. The other thing is Lusaka is quite complicated. And the fact that as a CU for us, we were more focused on sewerage. Then we changed to also taking up on-site and FSM in particular. For us, it has really given us a drive because we've seen the impact that we've been able to make. Because if you have a city where 90% of the population is on-site, that just gives you that impetus for you to make sure that you do something about it and make a change. So the fact that we've seen the achievements that we have in Lusaka, for the smaller cities, we are hoping will even do far much better. And also what is comforting for us is we have a lot of stakeholders. So we've taken like a multi-sectoral approach where we have different stakeholders coming in with different expertise, different capacities, different innovations to bring to the table. So we are looking forward to see how we go to the other cities. And also, as we are in Lusaka already, we are starting activities in a smaller district in Kafue, where we intend to see how whatever we've done in Lusaka will work for a smaller city that is not as complicated as Lusaka. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. Asim?
Yeah, I think Rishi, thanks for, I think that question is again very valid question, that how do you work with small and medium towns? Because at CEP, we have been very cautious of taking this decision to only mainly work with the small and medium towns. The reason being that the cities that we talked about, Wai and Sinnar, they are actually representative of 4,000 towns in India. There are 500 larger cities, the corporations, which are beyond 1 million, but these other cities, which are up to 100,000 population, ranging from 30 to 100,000, it's almost like 4,000 cities of India, and many, I think, small and medium towns of Africa and Southeast Asia as well. So while working with these cities, the larger cities generally have a very vertical system. It's a more file-based system. Various departments are there, and it's a very long drawn process that you have to engage with. But especially in small towns, because it's a smaller administrative wing that you have to work with, you have to, the main thing that we have learned from the experience is that you have to learn to follow the entire process of the local government. So you can't tweak, because your grant ends in 3 years, you can't tweak a approach to make it happen very quickly. If you want to scale that up to 4,000 cities of India, you have to follow the tendering process. It has to go from one department to other. It has to have all the signatures from the mayor, from the chief officer, from the inspector for the tender to get approved. So we have actually followed that process in our work, so that it's not that only we are able to do this in Y and Sinha, but scale it up in Maharashtra as well as at the country level. And the tender document that I shared as a resource document on the chat, that document has been used by various other cities for their tendering process without the hand-holding support of CWAS. So that's the way you have to scale up and work with small towns. And our approach was that if you're able to do it in 2 cities, any other city in the country could do it, because we didn't change any government processes. It was all government process that was followed for engaging with the private operator. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Asim. George Osvaldo, anything to add from a Mozambique water perspective?
Yes.
Osvaldo here.
Yeah, I think that we here in Mozambique, we have the scale up is very promised. There are a lot of potential for the scale up, even for the small town. So the example that we bring here, it is all about the Great Maputo, but these initiatives are happening in the small towns around the country. So the help that USAID gave us years ago, mapping all of the private water operators in Mozambique, gave us an opportunity to replicate those examples around the country. And we realized that there exist some private operators, and we have now really good initiative that we are helping those private sector operators in order to get more professional. So I think that what is happening now in the great area of Maputo, it's still happening. It is scaling up to the other areas of the country. And what we need to do, it is a kind of continuous work. It is to realize that our goal is the same. Since what George was telling, our compromise as a country to the SDG is the same. So, since as a public sector and for the private sector, and that is what is helping now for the case of Mozambique. Thank you.
Thanks, Osvaldo. George, anything to add from a regulator perspective?
Yes, thank you. I mean, we are coming to the point that now it's evident that we need to change a little bit of the approach that we are using, or we are trying to use, because this is linked with the political arrangement. Everything was centralized so it was top to down. But now we are coming across that no, we must change then it's bottom up. Give more, as Mansour was saying, give more roles, more space to the local government. So the local government must be the one who take care of the compliance, and the central government, those who are on the top, come up with they set the rules, the procedures, and then the implementation is down. So I think this change of approach is the one will be a way to solve this, let's say, the issue. Thank you.
Thanks for that, George. Really appreciate the whole bottom-up approach, working with rather than working at the cities, as Asim, you were saying, in terms of just making sure we are not trying to change them, but changing our approach to suit the processes that exist for a variety of reasons. So one of the things which, across the discussion we have had, and there are a couple of questions on the chat on that, is the fact that the cost of monitoring some of the private sector engagement is quite high. Asim, you already started talking about some of the initiatives you have taken to try and digitize some of that value chain, especially in sanitation, and trying to bring that cost down. Would love to hear more in terms of where you think is the cost highest and how that could be brought down. Maybe, Asim, you could kick us off since you were already talking about it. And then Yvonne and Osvaldo, you could come in.
I think in terms of monitoring, what I would say, and there are two costs. One is the physical cost of actually getting, for example, we started with a monitoring form which was a 4 Xerox. So it was like a carbon copy of 4, where one copy had to be given to the household, where all the details about the desludging were done. In the second carbon copy went to the treatment plant operator, which had signatures of the households as well as the treatment plant operator that the sludge has been received. And the third and fourth carbon copy were kept by the private operator and the local government. So now one cost is about this printing. If I have to desludge 100 septic tanks, it's okay. It's like a booklet. But we had to desludge like 8,000 septic tanks. So it's a huge amount of printing cost that goes into that. But I would still not highlight that too much. What I would say is the actual monitoring of the local government. How do you monitor whether the services are actually safe, whether the services have been provided in the correct manner? So this was the question that we asked us, because the printing cost can be adjusted in the overall bidding, but the whole softer component about the safety aspects of the sanitation workers, the households, no manual scavenging is happening in India specifically. It's a big criminal offense. How do you monitor all that? So that led us to development of this app. Now this app is a one-time investment. It costs us something for sure, but you have to look at the life cycle cost of that. So now that app is now being used by 300 cities. We had to develop a prototype from a grant, but now it is replicable and can be used by anybody. So that's the way I look at the cost as well. And I would not say if you look at the entire, the operation cost, the monitoring cost is actually not much, but it's the monitoring and the time that people have to put. And to reduce this time effort of the local government as well as the private operator, we introduce this online monitoring apps so that it becomes much quicker, faster, and you can't fudge around with that data as well. So I would say that, yeah.
Thanks, Asim. Yvonne, George, you were also talking about monitoring costs, so maybe either of you want to come in, or Osvaldo?
Of course, the cost of monitoring is quite high, but for us, maybe as Lusaka, how we've dealt with it, as I said earlier, we have the unit within the utility that does the monitoring on a monthly basis. Then also we've developed a system of verifying all the activities all the way. So we are in the process of increasing the number of the service providers who will be working with come 2024, because currently we have about 52 on our database. And we are in the process of issuing permits for all these, meaning that we'll have to be monitoring their activities all the way. So the major cost that we see is mostly on the human resource to do this. Then in terms of data, we have developed what we are calling the Lusaka Sanitation System, where information is uploaded. So the service providers collect data and they enter this on the system. So the other costs will be in terms of the equipment, because all of them will have the tablets, but with the increase in number, we are likely to see an increase in the cost because we'll need more people to do this monitoring. So in as much as they are submitting this data, we also need to verify on the ground whether they are working according to the SOPs. So for us, that is the major cost driver in terms of monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Osvaldo, I remember you had done some GIS mapping as well of private players. So do you want to sort of come in and talk about that a little bit?
Yes. But first, let me say that we, 4 years ago, we developed what we call SINASH. It's a kind of national water and sanitation information system that we developed, and we are implementing it, but with a lot of challenge.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Speaking on which has to happen at least once. But no, so Osvaldo will look forward to your typed in response. George, do you want to sort of come in and talk about a little bit on any initiative that you're running?
Yeah, on the monitoring, yes, cost of monitoring. This still an issue for us because, as I said, for the monitoring of sanitation, we are starting at the very beginning. We don't have yet the staff and the means to monitor. but we are also investing in a platform that is where we are going to put the data there. I mean, where the utility will put the data so that we can at least follow the service, the operation. But the physical cost to be there in the field, to see, to monitor, we're at the very beginning. So I hope that I will learn from this platform, from you, how the best way to respond to it. So we are at the very beginning. We know that it's a very, very difficult issue, the cost, on how to monitor it. Thank you.
Thanks, George. We have a few more questions. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get to them now because we are towards the end of the conversation. What we will try and do is we'll aim to sort of do an FAQ to make sure you get answers to all the questions that were in the chat box. But I'll, at this stage, like to take the opportunity to hand the floor back to Jesse to provide some reflections and close us off. Jesse, all yours.
Thank you so much, Rishi, and thank you to all our panelists. What some amazing experience being shared, and thanks to Abhishek for the presentation. I think some really powerful points were highlighted today. The first one being that SLPs are, of course, common, and they really do fill gaps in the formal services that typically exist in cities. And that if we are going to see progress, we have to make them a partner. I think there was a quote from the discussion today, partners, not vendors. That really stuck with me, that we really need to embrace small local providers, understand them, make them a real partner in finding a solution to universal access, recognize their investment that they've made, recognize the role they have, recognize that they just want to be viable and have a livelihood as well, and that we really need each other, and we need to recognize them as partners as we move forward. I know that's a big step in a lot of places in the world. There's politics, land tenure, and things that push against wanting to do that, but that we really need to move forward. The second thing I think I recognize is that there's probably a lot to gain from working with small local providers, but I'm not sure we're still all that great at articulating that and making the real case for why we need to engage them. Although our research really did uncover some rationale for that, and there are some success stories, for instance, coming from our partners that shared today. But I think we need to document that better and be able to articulate that better to make that case with our partners around the world. The last kind of more complex thing, of course, is that we heard a lot today about how there's no one-size-fits-all to leveraging and formalizing small local providers. It takes time. It's not cheap. We do have some examples of success, but they use a variety of mechanisms and tools to do so. Contracts, subsidies, providing equipment and incentives, organizing and coordinating them, licensing them, contracting them, monitoring. There's other things that we didn't even hear about today, providing capacity building, for instance. So there's a lot of tools in our toolbox, but really understanding the conditions at which those work and when and how is going to be really important to future research and future experience that we hopefully can develop together. Again, leading back to demonstrating how important it is to do this. So those are some of the major things I took away from this today, and I hope everyone also came up with some more important points. But that's really what I see as some of the most critical points. So with that, I think we are going to wrap up the webinar for today. Thank you again for everyone for joining. Again, thanks to our great partners, the panelists, CKM, Tetra Tech, and FSG for putting this together. Really appreciate it. As was mentioned in the chat box, we'll put together an FAQ with all the questions that are submitted, so you can refer back to those. The recording, the report with the findings will all be available on our USAID website, globalwaters.org. So please go there for further information or to get in touch. Again, thank you so much for joining, and hope to see you on the next webinar. We'll probably have a series of these coming as part of the Action Research Initiative from USAID on different topics, so keep your eyes peeled. Thank you so much.